Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Beyond the MVR, Making the Most of the Driver Lifecycle. My name is Cynthia Woods. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at AccuSource, and I will be your moderator today. Today's presentation will last approximately 45 to 50 minutes with a Q&A period to follow. Please submit any questions you have via the live chat function of the GoToWebinar software. We will answer as many questions as we have time for during our live broadcast. However, if time does not permit, we'll be happy to answer any questions on an individual basis after the webinar has concluded. A copy of this presentation will be available within 48 hours. If you would like a copy of the recorded presentation, please contact us at marketing@accusourceonline.com, and we'll be happy to provide a copy to you. So to begin the presentation, I would like to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Tom Gillogly, Director of Solutions at Samba Safety, and Jerry Baker, Vice President of Channel Partnerships at Samba Safety. Tom is a Director of Solutions Engineering for the last 4 years and is focused on helping organizations improve driver safety and compliance. Tom has over 15 years of experience in enterprise systems, data process, and analysis, and has served in the services, operations, and sales fields. Additionally, Tom has led teams related to data processing, aggregation, and data analysis that have resulted in increased revenue and operational effectiveness. Tom has a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Wyoming. We also have Jerry Baker. Jerry is Vice President of Channel Partnerships and is a 30-year technology veteran with experience and success in enterprise software, software as a service, and professional service companies. Prior to joining Samba Safety, Baker served in leadership roles at several technology providers. He is a graduate of the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado, has a bachelor's degree in finance and 2 grown children, and lives with his wife in Denver. So now I'd like to go ahead and turn this over to Jerry.
Great, thanks, Cynthia, and thanks to everybody who's joining us today. We appreciate the opportunity to speak to you for a brief little bit about driver safety and driver risk management. We are partnered with AccuSource to promote driver safety and address driver risk for employee populations. And so this is a great opportunity for us to talk a little bit about why we believe that's important and the impacts that we believe we can have towards creating safer communities through driver risk management programs. I will advance here. The slight delay on this, so bear with us as we go through. So our agenda today, just briefly covering driver risk, top concerns for organizations with driving employees. One of the things that I want to point out is when we talk about drivers who drive for work, many people think of commercial drivers and over-the-road drivers as really those who need to be looked at from a driver safety standpoint. And the reality is there's about 70 million employees who drive for work-related purposes in the United States alone. And so there's 7 million commercial drivers. And so as you can tell, the vast majority of the driving population for work is those non-commercial drivers, whether they're driving a company-owned vehicle or they're a salesperson being reimbursed for driving for work purposes. So lots of drivers representing a fair amount of risk and liability for their employers on the road. So we'll talk a little bit about why employers care or should care. We'll discuss ways to help identify the risky drivers within the driving population. And we'll talk a little bit about what we call the visibility gap, and that's really the gap that employers have into understanding their drivers, their driver history, and their driver behavior, good and bad. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the driver life cycle. Many companies have a safety policy. Many incorporate driving practices into that safety policy. And we'll talk about some standard practices and some ways to maybe improve on those, and some of the tools to really help manage those policies that typically have been developed but are seldom enforced because of the lack of tools and automation to help enforce that safety policy. So we'll cover those topics, and as Cynthia mentioned, we'll look forward to some questions around the topics as well. So why employers care? The fact is that on average, you're going to see 1 in 5 drivers involved in some sort of crash throughout the year. That could be as routine as a little fender bender or hitting a light pole to something significant with injuries and so forth. And the fact is, even good drivers have accidents. And these are just the statistics that roughly 20% of the population is going to be involved in some form of auto accident on an annual basis. 1 in 2 personal injury lawsuits do involve auto accidents. And I'm sure, like us here in Denver, you've seen advertisements and billboards where you are with plaintiff attorneys really putting the word out that they can help drivers who have been involved in an accident chase down and pursue their legal rights and course of action from accidents. The industry is full, it's busy, and as we all know, we live in a very litigious society, and so these personal injury lawsuits are extremely prevalent, and slightly over half of them are really around auto accidents. And for good reason, this industry thrives because 3 in 5 personal injury lawsuits are won by the plaintiffs. So the odds are kind of stacked against drivers, and especially employers who are with drivers driving on behalf of work-related initiatives. So what do you do about that as an employer, and how do you maybe identify risky drivers? One of the things at Samba that we look at are really what are the true costs associated with risky driving and driving behaviors. When accidents occur, there are a number of costs that are involved, some obvious, some maybe not so obvious. The repair that takes place just to repair vehicles or property damage can be significant. The underlying impact to insurance premiums can be significant as well. Obviously, we all know from personal experience, if we have an accident or we have a claim, our rates are typically in line to go up. Magnified for our employers when you have large driving populations, auto premiums are impacted, but also things like medical benefit, so medical insurance when there are accidents and injuries associated with it, whether it's your employees or those who are impacted by your employees, to just other forms of commercial insurance that are certainly impacted by accidents that take place in the workplace or on the job. Workers' compensation claims, time lost, another significant cost impact to employers with auto accident related losses, as well as just productivity, the number of days lost by employees who have been involved in an auto accident. And then, of course, potentially legal fees, which can become significant when there's at-fault auto accidents, and especially if the company is found to have shown negligence in putting drivers behind the wheel that maybe they shouldn't have, with bad driving histories and records. And when these accidents occur, the potential for punitive damages just makes these events, somewhat significant and potentially catastrophic. We all have read about and heard of some high-profile cases, whether it's Walmart or FedEx or others, where large name companies with large driving populations have had significant and serious accidents. And the thing is, the driver is quickly put behind, the focus quickly shifts from the driver to the company, because obviously that's where the liability lies, that's where the deeper pocket lies. And the reputational risk for some of these companies is dramatic. Stock price impacting accidents have occurred, time and again, and the examples are pretty large. So at Samba, our experience is when we look at the employee base and compare them to the costs associated on this left side, we start seeing some kind of risk categories within the employee population. And our findings are that at least half of the drivers are what we would consider good or clean drivers on average within large employee populations. So roughly 50% of the drivers that we monitor for their driving history and behavior typically account for 20% of the costs. Even good drivers have accidents. But on average, we are seeing that roughly half of an employee population is typically relatively clean. And when we look at the analysis, they account for maybe 20% of the overall spend associated with those categories that you see on the left side. Roughly 40% of the driving population might have some infractions. We kind of put them in this risk bucket, a yellow risk bucket that says, yes, there's some infractions. They may have a speeding ticket. They may have let their license expire, which does create some risk for the company as well. But generally, these are drivers that we want to get ahead of the curve and maybe take some action. Certainly in the commercial driving space, there's a high demand for qualified drivers. And so the last thing that companies want to do is pull qualified drivers out of their pool because of some infractions. And our efforts are really at identifying trends for those drivers who maybe have shown some instances that we want to keep an eye on, we want to monitor, maybe we want to remediate through driver training or through some sort of action. But it's really identifying some potentially risky driving before it becomes too serious. And while we can still take some action, develop that employee and kind of course correct their driving and their driving behavior. And then roughly 10% of the driving population on average are really the risky drivers that represent the highest degree of risk and liability to an employer. These are drivers that either should not be behind the wheel because of either suspensions or numbers of infractions. The company may score them. Companies like Samba may score them, and that could be a combination of a number of violations, 3 or 4 speeding tickets within 12-month period, for instance, or more serious infractions like DUIs or reckless driving, et cetera. And so typically we find that roughly 10% of that driving population is really contributing to 40% of the spend in those areas like insurance, repairs, workers' comp, accident-related costs. And so our focus at Samba is to help identify where each of those drivers falls within these risk categories so that we can take the appropriate steps. And in general, this is the challenge that a lot of employers face is if that 10% exists on average within the employee population, how do we identify those drivers and take immediate action to remove that risk and liability? How do we identify the drivers that we want to develop, kind of keep from having that next event, make sure that we're getting ahead of the curve on addressing that driving behavior? And then the green population of we really don't have to worry about them. We may even want to incent them as an example of good driving behavior and contributing back to the company and to the community at large. So that's a little bit on the importance of identifying the risky drivers, and to kind of talk a little bit more about the visibility and the cost of not having that visibility in terms of risk and the liability that companies face. Tom will cover a little bit of that here in the next few slides.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. So what we want to do is spend some time talking about current process and how our customers and prospects, through discussion, how we've learned they've attempted to deal with some of the issues that Jerry highlighted. So the first thing that they're going to do is they may, as part of their pre-hire process, some of you may be doing this, pull an MVR, determine whether or not the driver is fit to drive, or if the employee is going to be driving as part of their role, whether or not that's safe for the company to assume that driver into their risk. Or they may do it as part of an annual process related to process and or compliance. This arrow represents time. So what you see here is over time, as time lengthens, your visibility goes down. And that's simply because that MVR that you pulled is a point-of-time MVR. It let you know going backwards what was going on with that record, but over time, you don't know what's going on with that individual in their record. Next, at the same time, liability is going up. And the reason liability is going up is because there's events that are partaking against the driver that are show up on their motor vehicle record and other records that says they were speeding, they had a DUI, they had a suspension. All these things are adding significant liability to your company because in the event of a crash and there's injury or death, significant costs in the form of punitive damages that Jerry spoke about. Also just general costs around crashes. So there could be reportable crashes that show up on an MVR, could be non-reportable crashes, just behavioral type things that the driver's doing to cause your organization cost. We call that gap the visibility gap. So customers, prospects, people we talk to, they acknowledge the gap exists, and what they want to do is reduce that gap. The problem is that takes people, time, and money. So it's too expensive to pull an MVR every month. You don't have the people to decode all the MVRs when you do get them. You don't have the time to do that because it's so burdensome. So what they want is a solution that's going to help them reduce that gap through automation, exception reporting, and then monitoring the driver in a better way. All those things in combination are going to actually reduce that visibility gap, which is going to reduce your liability as a company and also allow you to be more proactive. So if you think about it, there's also an opportunity that's lost through that time, and that's an opportunity to intervene early with the driver, maybe after that first speeding ticket, follow up through policy and training, and remediate that behavior, make a behavioral shift so that the further actions aren't required. It can also help with detention and other opportunities like that. So that's what we call the visibility gap, and it's really just the lost visibility over time that you lose after you've run that initial MVR or that annual MVR. Some of the things that companies do, they acknowledge this exists, is they create a policy. So out of that policy, they'll run an MVR. Normally, there's some kind of self-reporting that goes along with that policy, meaning if you leave it up to the individual to self-report a violation that's outside of your policy, there may be an ongoing review of that MVR or those self-reported events. There's some type of intervention, meaning, hey, Mr. Driver, we noticed that you had this happen on your record. We need to follow up with you. You need to take some training. And then there may be some action. So that could be moving on from the employment. It could be other punitive type action. It could be training and other things like that that are more proactive. The problem with all this is it's very time burdensome. 9 out of 10 companies acknowledge that they have a driver policy, but only 1 of 10 acknowledge that they are implementing it efficiently. So to implement it efficiently, you need to do it in a better way. So you need to standardize and automate the scoring related to that MVR, so you're not spending a lot of time reviewing it. You need to continuously review records, so you see whether or not a new citation showed up on the MVR, or if the license has become invalid because of something like child support, lack of paying child support, things that are adding significant risk to your organization. Then rather than reviewing all MVRs, you only want to review the exception ones. So maybe the drivers that are in that red and yellow group that Jerry spoke about, the red would be ones you need to be very quickly reacting to. The yellow gives you an opportunity to intervene early and modify that behavior before it becomes a problem. And then you need intervention in the form of driver training. So follow up, it might be behind the wheel, it could be web-based training, it could be just follow up on policy, clearly outlining what's expected of the driver, and then having some kind of consequences to when they're not doing what's expected of them is really what the intervention step is. And then the full life cycle management is really just all of those combinations so you can take good action. So you know after that first event, you have that official motor vehicle record where you can take action and or modify behavior. All those things are important to keeping your driver safe and productive and behind the wheel, which is what everyone wants. There's a significant cost with getting new people in the door in the form of recruitment and other things. So people want to keep the retention high, and one of the best ways to do that is to help your drivers stay safe and to help them modify their behavior before it becomes a problem. So all of these things are what our customers are looking for in the form of a solution to help them better enforce their driver policy. Jerry, any other thoughts you had around that?
No, I think we've covered the majority of it. I think again, our focus is really just to help create the awareness within the driving population and take the mystery out of who's behind the wheel, what's their driving history and behavior that we need to be aware of, what are events that we maybe want to remediate, and then create a safer driving population and reduce costs for our customers, the employers, but really focus on creating safer communities, which is obviously something we all care about. So I think we've kind of covered what we had wanted around safety policies, how maybe to improve on them, what typical practices are. So Cynthia, I think with that, we'll turn to you and see if there's any questions that we can help answer.
Perfect. So I have Courtney Woods, our sales development specialist today, who has the list of questions that people have provided. So I'll let her go ahead and start with the first question. Courtney?
Yes, good morning. The first question, is the solution different for commercial versus non-commercial drivers?
Yeah, I'll take that one. This is Tom speaking. That's a great question. The core of the solution is the same for both the commercial drivers and non-commercial drivers. There are specific things related to commercial drivers and compliance that we have very specific features to make it really easy for you to stay on top of compliance and have the information that you need like medical certification information and other things to make compliance easy. But the core problem, and that is the lack of visibility into drivers, their records, and their behavior, is the same across those drivers that may just be driving a sales vehicle and getting reimbursed for the mileage, and those professional drivers that are forced to meet a bunch of requirements in order to operate the vehicle over the road.
Thank you. Can driver monitoring impact my insurance rates?
Yeah, great question, Jerry. Did you want to take that, or you?
Yeah, I'll touch on that. As we talked about, there's a number of different insurance premium potential impacts, not just the commercial auto insurance that you might have for your driving population, but when you start considering, just your potential medical costs, the workers' comp claims that we touched on, and certainly in a commercial environment, just that safety rating associated with your company and the driving population's impact on that. So we've spent a lot of time with commercial insurance brokers and even underwriters who are looking for ways to help their clients. They want to reduce their losses, of course, and so they're very motivated from that end. But they're really looking at ways to drive down the employer's costs and, frankly, increase the safety of the organization. So we work with a lot of companies whose commercial insurance broker and potentially even the carrier themselves have a keen interest in seeing programs like driver monitoring or anything else that's going to improve driver safety. And in some cases, they've actually even co-funded those solutions. So absolutely, it can have an impact. We're cautious to say that it's up to each individual carrier and broker, and it's not necessarily going to drive costs down, but there's certainly examples of where it does, or at a minimum, keep premiums from going up.
Thank you. Who are the primary stakeholders, and who usually sponsors the driver monitoring initiatives within your customers?
I'll touch on this, and Tom, feel free to jump in. That's a great question, and the answer is there's a lot of stakeholders within an organization. When we talk with human resource organizations, a lot of times they're focused on getting the best candidates in. As Tom mentioned, typical practice, along with a more complete background screen, to pull a motor vehicle record and look at that driver's history. And the HR function within companies does a good job of presenting good quality candidates. After that, we typically are working with risk and safety folks within an organization, but often it's really a consensus across the board between the human resources team, the risk and safety folks within an organization, and in a lot of cases, potentially even the legal and financial, CFO, chief counsel, where they realize, the potential heavy impact of lawsuits and other, negative consequences coming from accidents or risky driving. So stakeholders across the board in an organization, all with their different priorities and focus, but all with the same goal in mind: to create a better driving environment, safer communities, and certainly lowering costs as part of that to the employers.
Thank you. What types of activity does Samba Safety monitor, and what events trigger an MVR to be pulled?
Yeah, great question. This is Tom. I'll field that one, and Jerry can fill in where I fall short. Generally speaking, we are looking for negative activity related to the motor vehicle record. So it could be in the form of a new alert that the license is no longer valid. It could be a new speeding ticket, some other types of activity. Generally speaking, in most states, it's a negative type event that's triggering, and that's important to you because you need to know those things. One new speeding ticket may put them outside of your policy, which is creating a risk to your organization, and that's behavior they're going to want to ultimately try to modify or remediate if you can. So generally speaking, it's a negative event on the motor vehicle record on a monthly or better basis.
Okay, this is our last question. What does the implementation timeframe look like?
Yeah, great question. And the implementation is a very simple process. Our team will work with you in cooperation with AccuSource to determine how you want the drivers to appear in your system as far as organization-wise. And then it's as simple as getting a list of drivers in a spreadsheet and uploading those into the system. There is some paperwork, depending on the state you're in, that may be required that could lengthen that a little bit. But typically, it's a 1 to 2 week process to get the drivers in and then loaded into the system, returned back with scores, and then start to monitor their motor vehicle records moving forward.
Thank you. That was all of our questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Courtney. And at this time, it brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. I'd like to thank Tom and Jerry for the great job that they did in their presentation today. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today for Beyond the MVR, Making the Most Out of the Driver Lifecycle. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website shortly. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.